Good morning, everybody. Hello. My name's Matt Dormer. I'm from BT Wi-Fi. We're really delighted to be able to host this event with HOSPA for you all today. Hopefully, it should be very informative and interesting. Once the event's finished, we'd like you all to join us at the top of the tower. There's some lunch and some drinks, and hopefully the weather's cleared up a bit so you can get a better view. Myself and my colleague Danny, who's hiding, he's over there, will be around all day. Looking forward to sort of being able to meet and talk to many people as possible. But now I would like to introduce the host, who's going to do all the things. So Jane Pendlebury.
Thanks very much, Matt. And thanks everyone for coming, turning up today on a bit of a miserable, hot, steamy day outside. But let me welcome our experts to the stage. So Jackie, Katie, Giuseppe and Charlie, if you'd like to come on up, that would be lovely, thank you. I'm not going to knock anything behind me. Fabulous. So as Matt kindly introduced me, we are HOSPA, the Hospitality Professionals Association. Hopefully you all know that because I think the majority of you are our members. If you're not, then please feel free to join. I'm Jane Pendlebury, I'm the CEO, and I've got lots of colleagues here in the audience as well. And if you don't know people, then please do ask us to make introductions because we'd be really happy to do that. Got to tell you that there's no fire alarm planned for today. I'm just checking my phone is on silent, so feel free to do the same. And as Matt said, we're going to finish around noon, depending on how much audience participation we get today, because we are actually relying on you to keep this debate going. And there'll be guidance for lunch to go up to the very top. I think the lift takes 16 or so. So if you go back to where we were, you'll be guided along to the lifts to go upstairs for lunch. So we're here, as you know, to talk about the Employment Allocation of Tips Bill, which I've actually got a copy of here if anybody wants to see the real thing. And I will introduce you to the experts in a moment, but first we went out, our lovely PR company, Pick PR, went out onto the streets and did some interviewing of the wider British public. So now I don't know whether I press play or those lovely men in there press play. We're going to hear now some Vox Pop.
Yes, generally.
Yes.
Yeah, always, yeah. Got to, absolutely. You never know what they're earning, so... And it was always nice. I worked in a tipping for 3 years, and it was always lovely. Those people who did tip always stick in your head.
It can just help to make someone feel better.
I think if the service is exceptional and they give you what you've asked for, as opposed to not.
Do I tip? The answer to that is no, I don't tip. If it's a small family-run restaurant, I will tip. Big national chains, no, not really.
Yes.
Okay.
We don't tip if we're just going to have a drink or a coffee, but if we have a meal, yes.
I think it's something that should be done because obviously people work very hard.
I don't feel like I should have to tip because I feel like it encourages a culture where big national restaurant chains can continue paying their employees minimum to unfair wages, and we have to foot the bill by contributing to that.
More or less, people are earning their money doing the job, so why do you have to tip them?
It's your business. If you want to tip, you can tip. I won't look down on you if you don't tip.
I've just come back from France and they don't really tip over there. They just round it up. Yeah, I don't mind tipping for good service. Do you tip just because they've served you a meal at a table? Well, that's their job, yeah.
On some places I've been to, there's boxes where it says 15, 20, 22 or 25. No, I'll put in what I think, not what I'm being told to put in.
I think these days with the tap element, I think it's maybe in Britain even harder to tip. It's almost like not an embarrassment if you don't tip.
I would have it scrapped altogether. Still have a culture where we're encouraged to tip if the service is, exceptional. By and large, it's when I'm not asked to tip or I don't see anything added to the bill, I will pay the bill and, throw in a bit of extra on top of that.
Well, I always pay by cash, so I will tip by cash.
I always pay cash at the end.
Yeah.
I hope it goes then direct to the person who served me.
A lot of places are now paying on the app, so you can choose to add a tip, which is how I prefer paying.
service at restaurants and things. I wouldn't tip in a bar, for example.
The one who's probably serving on me, probably the waiter who comes to my table.
Oh, I always tip the taxi driver because I've usually got a lot of shopping and they always carry it for me. You don't mind tipping people like that.
If I was to tip, it would be a restaurant, but as I said, that'd be more sort of the family-run, independent, the smaller businesses.
No, I wouldn't. If the service was that bad, then I would say I'm not paying any service charge because for these reasons.
Yeah, I do. I have, a couple of times. Sometimes the service charge is a little bit too much for me to pay, and I feel so uncomfortable and so bad saying, sorry, can I take off the service charge? I do want to tip, but £15 is a little bit, yeah.
Yes, I do. Actually, tell a lie, I did. But I think it's one of those things where you get used to it and you grow a thick skin.
I've done it. If I've gone with a friend, and I always say, we'll split the bill and we'll tip. Don't put it on the bill.
That's a very good question because my son worked in the service industry himself, and generally speaking, some places enforce that it just goes into the till, and then the staff can be awarded something as a Christmas bonus.
Well, I'd like to think again, going back to the sort of smaller businesses and the big chains, smaller businesses I wouldn't mind it seeing going into everyone's pockets and supporting the business. Bigger chains, again, I probably wouldn't like to see it go into the till, if I'm completely honest.
I think it should go to everyone no matter what, because everyone plays a role in some part of it.
Would prefer the individual, but sometimes there are others at work and they can't get a tip because of what they do, whereas then it should be shared.
So it's interesting, isn't it? Different views from different people and not necessarily generational, which is what I suspected it might be before we did this. The other thing we did was we actually did some more formal research rather than anecdotal. So we went out to 1,000 people and asked them some questions, which we are going to produce a fuller report on, but just the headlines I wanted to share with you today. So next. It's not pressing. So 81% of people already tip. I don't know if that's a surprise to you, but it's a fairly significant number. This just isn't working for me. I'll go to 71% would prefer to add a tip separately as opposed to add it on your bill. Now, I think that's a really interesting one. That chap in the interviews was saying that he didn't like it when you want to add 10, 15, 20, 25%. So I think that's possibly something we'll come on to a little later. 82% would prefer the individual who served them rather than it being split to the wider team as well. Now, we're all industry people here, so we'll understand that, but it's interesting from the wider British public that their view is that it should just go to literally the person who has been charming at your table. And I think this is the last slide. Only 9% wanted to see tipping scrapped altogether, which is another topic that I know we will touch on today. There is more in that survey, but I just wanted to share the headlines with you today. So anyway, we have some brilliant experts with me today who really know what they're talking about, rather than me who just has opinions on it. So I'd like to introduce, I'll go from them. We've got Jackie Roberts from BDO, who's here to talk to us about tax and employment specifically. Katie Linstead, who operates a Tronc master service for a lot of people, so is an expert on Tronc, and her background is also payroll, so she's got some interesting perspective on that. We've got Charlie Barnes from RSM, who is our legal expert today. Thank you. And then to represent all of the operators out there, we've got Giuseppe Daniello, who's a sommelier at The Edition. And I just do want to point out that when Giuseppe speaks, he's talking on behalf of his, or just operators in general, and not specifically The Edition. Just wanted to make that clear, that he's not here representing his employers, he's just here representing an operator from our perspective. So the other thing I wanted to say was we really are looking for a lot of audience interaction today. So we're going to set the scene with our experts just to sort of lay the groundwork so that everybody knows what we're talking about. But as soon as that sort of first 10, 15 minutes is over, we are really looking for interaction. So please just fling up your hand, or if you get very angry, just shout out. But it might be easier if we control it a little. But I think probably if we start with Charlie, if you could just show us the lay of the land from a legal perspective, that would be great. Thank you.
Certainly. Thanks, Jane. Yeah, thank you all very much for joining this morning. I'm an employment lawyer, so I'm very interested in this new piece of legislation. I think that's the first point I would make. It's obviously very new. It hasn't been tested whatsoever, so it is open to interpretation, but I'm just here to give you, I think, what is, from my perspective, the headline issues that, from what I can see, and just a recap of probably what everyone here is aware of, but perhaps a bit more sort of insight just from my perspective and what we might see in the future. Been enacted 2nd of May 2023, but the majority of the provisions within the Act will not come into force until we get secondary legislation. So that's regulations that will be introduced by the Secretary of State, Department for Business and Trade. There is a possibility, I mean, certainly the government have given themselves the opportunity to step back, I would say, but they have, in their press release, committed to doing something by 2024. So they've given themselves about a year from the point at which they introduced the Act. So we're looking at around April, May, we would anticipate that the legislation will come into force in its entirety. And what does it actually do? So sort of in a nutshell, I would say one of the sort of questions that we get asked is, does it relate to all tips, service charges and gratuities? And yes, it does. Everything from my perspective is included. The only thing that I can see would be excluded from the definition of qualifying tips, gratuities and service charge is only those that the worker is paid to the worker, and the worker is effectively has the choice of what they want to do with it. If in any way the employer or a third party on their behalf chooses what to do with it or controls how that tip is allocated, that would be caught by this Act in my view. It's also an important point is that the duty will be to allocate tips fairly in respect of those, and when I say I'm just tips, I mean gratuities and service charges, just quite a lot to get into one sentence. But that duty is in respect of all tips that are paid at or attributable to a place of business. So that, from my interpretation, it would be a single site because of the definition of what they've used for place of business. I think that's an area of complication and potentially an area of interpretation which we might see play out later on. The only deductions that you can make from those tips that you have a duty to allocate will be statutory deductions. Jane will be talking about that in a bit more detail. And also, when we talk about this duty, it's not only a duty in respect of an employer's own workers, it's also agency workers that are supplied to it by an employment business. Now, that also creates a little bit of complexity. How is it going to be implemented? A code of practice, the government has said is going to be issued. We haven't got that code yet, so that's what this secondary legislation, the regulations will do. That will introduce that code of practice. Government has said that has to be consulted with ACAS before it can be published, and other stakeholders should be brought into that process as well. That then code has to go before the Houses of Parliament, both House of Commons, House of Lords, to be approved before it can be enacted. So we're still some work to do. What that will do is set out what is fair. That of itself, if you were to not follow that code, according to the legislation, that would not technically be a breach, but effectively it can be interpreted by employment tribunals when considering considering a claim from a worker who believes that you failed to comply with this legal obligation. And that kind of leads me on to that last point, which is really about the risk here, because now what this will do, it will introduce a new claim that workers and employees and agency workers can bring in respect of the allocation of tips and the information that's also provided by employers regarding how those tips are allocated, because there are information requirements such as policies that will have to be produced. And also there's an information request process from workers where they can ask you every 3 months for information about how you are fairly allocating tips. And I think that's also something to bear in mind from the perspective of an administrative obligation that it could create for you, and just to be aware of when you're sort of walking through what your policies and procedures are going to be like to help you manage the possible impact of this legislation. And I think that's really what I wanted to cover, really. I think that's covering the the board basics, but we can pick up on some of those topics.
Brilliant, thank
later
you,
on.
Charlie. On that point there about the code of practice going forward and ACAS, they are working with UK Hospitality, and the research that we undertook, we've actually done that in conjunction with UK Hospitality, so we are feeding into UK Hospitality as well, so we should be able to have some influence on that. Now, we've already got a question, but we haven't set the scenes. Is it a quick one, Patrick?
It is a quick one, sorry, I'm showing my ignorance here. I'm probably knows the answer to this. But you've given a little bit of background around some of the sort of formalities around it. You haven't actually said what basic legislation is and what is. Maybe I should know that beforehand, but I don't.
Oh, well, so effectively, it's the duty on the employer will be to fairly allocate all tips, gratuities and service charges that are collected at a place of business amongst its workers and employees and agency workers. That's what the duty will be on you. What that looks like in terms of how to fairly allocate will depend upon what this code of practice says. And a point to also elaborate on is that troncs will still be an acceptable way in which to do that. But that's that gap of what we don't know is what is a fair way in which to allocate those tips service. So yeah, apologies that it's not more than that at the moment, but that's where we are.
Thanks, Charlie. And Jackie, with your employment and tax head on, could you add to anything that Charlie has said, please?
Thanks, Charlie. That was a really good run through there of the legislation. So I have been with BDO for 18 years and have been supporting hospitality businesses through all of the recent ups and downs of employment tax, CJRS and national minimum wage. And more we're having conversations with our clients about the TIPS legislation. So I've been following it with Charlie through all its stages. At some points, even thinking it wasn't going to even happen. It did appear, didn't it, at one point that it was going to get pulled, but did carry on. So with that legislation, I guess from an employment tax perspective, when you're looking at tips and service charge, however that is described, firstly, from a tax perspective, is fairly simple. It's taxable. So it may be that it's actually the employee actually receives the tips themselves, they're given the cash themselves, or take it from the table, and then it's their responsibility to disclose that via self-assessment to HMRC, or alternatively, it could be that it's taxed via the tronc arrangement, which Katie's going to talk to more, or the employer themselves if there isn't a tronc scheme in place. So I guess the why are we having all of this conversation in from an employment tax perspective? That's because it's the social security that is important here, or the national insurance contributions. So where tips are distributed that are discretionary in nature, and they are not allocated with any involvement from the employer, they are not subject to NIC. So that's the big thing that we're sort of looking at in terms of the tronc arrangements, and will they be fit for purpose when it comes to integration with this legislation. So I was just sort of thinking, well, what's interesting about this from my perspective, and obviously I could talk about this for forever, but a couple of points here is, so that's non-discretionary tips. What are we going to do with those? So mandatory service charge can't go in a tronc arrangement anyway. So there's going to be national insurance, and who's going to foot that national insurance bill? How are we going to finance that? Particularly if those tips are going to be distributed to agency staff. So the idea is that the tips will be paid by the hospitality business to the agency, and then the agency will have to pay the employees of their agency. So that will then incur a employer's national insurance. And not to forget, actually, we've got apprenticeship levy. So when we're looking at the costs that would be liable to Social Security, don't forget the 0.5% apprenticeship levy, which needs to be added on to any business as well. So that's from my side. Thank you very much, Jane.
Thanks, Jackie. A really nice, concise summary there. But lead us really well on to Katie, who I didn't say was from Dataplan. Sorry, I missed the name of your company when I first introduced you. So Katie, please take on the tronc mantle.
Yes, so I work for Dataplan and Tronc Masters. So Dataplan is our payroll side of the business. Tronc Masters is just what it says on the tin. It's the trunk master's arm of the business, and I've worked in payroll for 20 years, and through a long part of that, I also worked in hospitality because I decided to save money and go to university as a mature student. So in the evenings, I was working for tips, and during the day, I was paying trunk schemes. At that time, I must say, I didn't really know how the allocation worked, and it's only in the last 5 years or so that I've been involved in that side of it. And really, we're looking at everything through the lens of practicality in terms of how to actually operate the code of practice when it comes out. At the moment, it's a little bit of a wild west in trunk schemes if they're not with an external trunk master, because the information is vague at best from HMRC, and the code of practice that exists is only voluntary in terms of fair tipping. So when this code of practice comes out, on the one hand, we're really pleased there'll be something hopefully more transparent and clear. And on the other hand, we're quite nervous that maybe consultation won't reach as far as it needs to operators. Already there's a huge burden on operators to collate all their data together and, get people paid properly. The involvement of agency workers as well, we can see as a big problem. I think also the point is to encourage employment, but I think if agency workers are receiving a higher wage plus tips as well, that doesn't encourage, employment with operators. So there's a few different kind of aspects to the code of practice we're nervous about. And I think it's really important that the industry as a whole is as educated as possible on what's happening, so that as a whole we can kind of group together and maybe make more of an impact on the code of practice than perhaps happened before the bill was given royal assent.
Brilliant, thank you, Katie. And Giuseppe, is there anything you want to add from an operator's perspective?
Definitely, I'm the less technical between the team, but I've been working in the industry since 12 years, and service charge has always been part of my salary. And with colleagues, with friends, service charge has always been obscure. We did, unfortunately, still unclear. Thanks to Katie, I've been working together with her in the last 2 years to try to rebuild the scheme of the service charge where currently I'm working. It's still difficult, to give a specific answer about service charge. There are still some issue between wages. Service charge is part of the contract. So I'm here exactly to represent probably the hospitality sector, the industry, and to try to find probably the best solution for tips and service charge that for my side are pretty much the same things. It goes on the same direction. And hopefully, thanks. I really appreciate him.
Brilliant. Sort of just anecdotally, my feedback from the industry as a whole is saying, yes, this is brilliant. It should go to the workers, because I think generally HOSPA, because we're the professionals, we tend to deal with, let's say, the 4- or 5-star hotel or the very professionally run businesses, restaurants, whatever they might be. And I think it's some of the lesser ones that have been, lesser, that's probably not the right word. There are businesses out there, I'm sure, who've been taking this and not distributing it fairly. And I think that's probably who the bill is more aimed at, the people who aren't doing the distribution. But most of the people that I speak to, and I know most of the operators in here, are distributing, if not 100%, then sort of high 90s%. And that sort of that bit that's kept back has been for direct costs, which I'm sure is something we will touch on today, because at this stage, you cannot take out any credit card charges, if you're going to pay your trunk master independently, that can't come out of that pool of money as well. So there are direct costs as well as the apprentice levy, which I think you mentioned, and then it gets even more complicated with national insurance and then agency workers. I'm sure we will cover all of that today. A lot of you in the audience here will know Howard Field. He helped us write the guide a good few years back now. I think it was 2016, 2017, on tips and service. And ever since I've known Howard, he's had an opinion on this. So he, I think, has fallen into your favourite place to be, isn't it, really, talking about this. But Howard comes at it from a different angle, really, don't you? There is an alternative view. Would you just like to say what your thoughts on it are, please? There's a mic there, or you can come up. It's up to you.
Right. Well, You've landed me right into it.
Yeah.
First of all, I would say that this subject is so much more complicated than what we've aired so far today. And even to the point where I think what went on in Parliament and what's gone on between the industry and the government has only scraped the surface, really, of this subject. What worries me is that the legislation is cementing out-of-date practices for our industry and giving us possibly constraints about modernizing and recognizing what's changed in the past X years. I've seen little change in terms of the chaos about tips and service charges and what's right and what's wrong, and I don't see this legislation actually resolving any of it. So I've got some notes here, and what I'd like to do is, if I may, take the opportunity to talk about fairness and what this legislation was designed to do, because I'm a little bit unsure of why exactly we needed to have an Act of Parliament and so much legislation around this subject. What is fair to whom? So if we look, for example, at the customer, by law, all the prices, retail prices, have to include VAT. And generally, that was to make sure that when you went to buy something, you could already see what the price was that you were going to have to pay. And that applied just as much in our industry as any other industry. So additions that are discretionary should be at your discretion. And therefore, anything which is added onto the bill before you get the bill, is it really discretionary? I mean, what discretion do you have? The only discretion you really have is not to pay it. And you heard some of the points that the people were making there about whether or not they liked to have charges already on the bill or whether they like to make their own mind up about that. There aren't any standards now for the level of that discretionary tip or service charge. So we heard on that those clips about going up to 25%, and certainly the range between 10 and 25% is an enormous range, and that's of the revenue of the business. We've heard a lot about restaurants, but hotels also have service charges, and they tend to be at the high-end hotels, the really expensive hotels, and they are generally around 5%, but they generate an enormous amount of money. So you've got no standards, really, to start with as to how much this revenue is going to be, even before you start thinking about who it should go to. In fact, if you look at the guide that HOSPA produced in 2018, that was a period when things like service charges were, the idea was to be transparent, but you could have a service charge to cover all sorts of things, and it might cover unpaid bills or breakages, or and what you did with it was, to an extent, a negotiation between the employer and the group of employees, because even at that time, troncs existed, and the impact of being able to distribute some of the income through the tronc gave you the tax advantages which we've heard about. And in fact, I think fundamentally, if those tax advantages weren't still built into the regime now, we'd be having a completely different conversation. It seems to me that it's almost totally dependent upon the saving of national insurance that we have all this complication to live with. So when a customer wants to reward a particular employee, there's no real mechanism for that today unless they pay cash. And I'm not sure if one of these tipping systems is individual to the employee, but almost always we're talking about money going into a tronc. And once it goes into a tronc, you actually have no say about who gets what and how it's distributed. And in many businesses, it's not distributed to the whole team. It's only distributed to defined individuals, and somebody playing the role of the tronc master is having a big influence on who gets what in terms of proportions. And of course, best practice is that all the explanations about what you're going to be charged, and I'm talking now about fairness to the customer, is that that's clearly shown on the bills and on the menus and on the tariffs. But you talk to people who stay in hotels and go to restaurants, and very often it's small print, and they don't appreciate until they get the bill just what the amount of money is that they've effectively committed to. So what about fairness to the employee? Well, for some time now, it's been, if you want to take advantage of the tax rules, national insurance rules on trunks, you cannot put into the contract of employment the amount of or proportion of pay that's going to go through the trunk system or through tips and service charges. So if you are a modern employer and you want to have a proper terms of employment with your employees that include all their earnings, that give you the opportunity to have incentives and share profits, etc., you can't really do that, because not only can you not include that element of the pay, but you are really discouraged from paying anything other than the minimum wage. So you're going to get, one way or another, you're going to get constraints about having the same contracts of employment that you have for non-service staff, for management, for other people, and in other industries. So you're going to be competing with people coming into our industry, having terms of employment which don't reflect what happens generally in business, can inhibit their ability to borrow, because banks and building societies may ignore the tips and service charges that they get. It reduces the base on which holiday pay and sick pay, which wasn't mentioned, is calculated. It reduces the amount from which they make pension payments and so on. So there are all sorts of things which don't appear, even if you've got this saving of national insurance. So, okay, I'll try to speed up a little bit. So, fairness to the employer. As I've already said, the employer is constrained from having proper relationship with the employee about their total earnings. And even more so if there's a trunk and they don't even have the ability to manage the allocations of money out of the trunk. And sometimes that can cause really big issues, because in some major operations, maitre d's and people like that are very much involved in making sure who gets the right share. And new employees and so on sometimes don't get to participate. And if we've got a legislation which says that any one employee can object, and it seems to go back to the employer, even though the employer has no ability to actually make those decisions. So I could see the lawyers having a feast, and I could see the industry not being very happy with the consequences of this legislation. There are also technicalities, like you have to pay out on a particular sequence the service charges. And if one thinks about where you've had payments in advance, you've had deposits, where you've had functions where they're not paid for a period of time after the function, or somebody doesn't pay at all, I can see all sorts of issues with the accounting for trunks, which have not really been thought about, because the old days where the cash on the table at the end of the shift could be shared out, we made it all very simple. But we now have agency staff and various other things to consider, and we're not allowed to use the trunk to smooth people's earnings over a period. It's got to be paid out every month. So those kinds of systems which existed, which allowed you to have some seasonality and some reflection on people who were on holiday and so on, have not so far been allowed for, or I don't see that. As far as fairness to others, to the sort of community at large, we are perpetuating something which is more or less unique to our industry. If you tip a hairdresser or a taxi driver, that's a one-to-one relationship. And generally speaking, there's nobody else involved in that, and there's no complications of trunks and so on. So I don't think they are comparables. I think we have a situation in our industry, especially in hotels, where, as I say, the 5% service charge in a hotel like Claridge's or the Dorchester creates an enormous fund. And you know, if you can't use it for pay, what are you actually going to use it for? In the past, you could use it to set up all sorts of off-balance sheet type arrangements, but that's going to be strange to do in the future. And if all you're really doing is hiding a price increase, well, then increase your prices, you know, and have full control. So I think that's my bottom line, is that to me, what we should be looking for as an industry is looking forward rather than backwards and finding a way to make the case for the anomaly of national insurance being abolished. I remember going to the Office of Tax Simplification, which doesn't exist now, some years ago in the Treasury, and the gentleman who was in charge was looking at combining national insurance and PAYE. Now, it's not on today's agenda, but it'll happen at some point. So what's going to happen in a situation like this, where the only reason for having separation of these earnings is to save national insurance? And if we're more forward-thinking, why not have a much better relationship between the employer and the employee, which doesn't involve complications, third parties, separation of significant parts of earnings, etc.? Have I made my case?
Yeah, I think you've added an awful lot. I think the biggest take of all of that in general is the transparency and fairness, which is key. But there were a lot of points raised there. So I don't know if anyone from the panel needs to react immediately to any of those, or if we've got comments from the audience. Oh, yes. Sorry, yeah, please go ahead.
Hello. So we've got, let's say, 3 business. 2 have a trunk system that was set up with BDO. 1 does not have a trunk system, so we operate a service charge and we pay tax, but it is still run like a trunk, i.e. we've got a trunk master and the money is separated by the trunk master on a point basic. I think it's a fair way. The money doesn't come in, I mean, it comes into the business, but it stays on the balance sheet, and then the trunk master take the value of that balance sheet every month and split it on a trunk point, and is distributed by the staff, so there is no deduction. So I don't fully agree with the gentleman. I think it's fair. It's not done by the business. We don't take money out of it. So okay. I don't see the problem.
That's a fair point. One of the reasons I think that there could be a problem is because the costs associated with that distribution, potentially, and credit card charges are the most obvious one. But there are also payroll implications, and when we were doing our planning meeting, I think Katie, you and I got onto a discussion about the payroll and people that potentially are claiming benefits as well, so the lower paid staff who are taking additional benefits, and when the trunk money or the tip money, however they get it, comes into their official pay packet, it can cause all sorts of problems. Shall I hand over to you to explain those?
Yeah, so there's just another sort of very practical issue to do with tips and service charges being paid to staff, either through payroll directly by the employer or through a trunk scheme first and then to the employee, is that we do have employees choose to opt out of receiving that money because they may be on universal credit. When HMRC created the trunk, I guess, it's not really, there's some legislation, but it's not really a system as such. They didn't create any mechanism for the reporting of that through real-time information reporting to indicate that it's a trunk system and not a second employment. So where you have 2 separate PAYE schemes, when the employer is reporting that or the trunk master is reporting that, it will generate 2 lots of payment for the employee, and if they're on universal credit, because trunk and tips are usually variable, it will constantly cause their universal credit to be reassessed, which means quite often they lose it for 2 months until it's reassessed and reassessed. So the seasonality aspect is a real problem if we can no longer hold back reserves to smooth out people's pay. but also just the potential for people who are within that system receiving a payment by accident can be quite a big impact to the employee as well, which causes, you know, a lack of motivation, lots of stress for the employees. So that's just another problem that potentially is has not really been looked at by HMRC.
And as Howard touched on, if someone's trying to get a mortgage or making pension contributions from their salary, it can really affect them, because often building societies or whoever you're getting your mortgage through won't look at anything other than your standard regular rate of pay. Katie?
Well, we actually have employees who do use, so they can use our trunk agreements and their pay slips, and they have been applying for mortgages and other financial products through having the right paperwork in place. If you don't have the right paperwork in place for the employee, they can't make those applications. But having trunk agreements, or if you don't have a trunk scheme, proper service charge or tipping agreements in place allows the employee to take their pay slips and make sure that they have all the right information to prove that they are receiving that money. It really depends on the financial institution, but some are taking those now.
So we've got a number of employers and people I know who've set up trunk systems here, sitting with us listening today. Has anyone had experience of people actually opting out of trunks? Is that something that's happening in London? Perhaps London's a bit of an exception. I know not everyone here is from London, but has anybody had any experience of that, or currently maybe smooths out the pay in the seasonality? So if you've got somewhere like Cornwall, which is presumably going to generate a lot more tips service charge over the summer, and less so in October, November, where it might all be in London for the conferences or the city centres. Are people currently smoothing it a bit more to the benefit of their employees? No. Well, that answers that question then, doesn't it? Right, brilliant. So one of the things we were going to discuss is, should service charge actually be considered the same as tips? When you're paying a service charge, is that if you're actually eating in a restaurant, drinking at a bar, or staying in a hotel, and there's a service charge, have you in your mind always considered that as a gratuity, or would you often tip on top of that? Because I think it has been done. In a lot of people do still assume that doesn't go to the employee. And I know a lot of people with their service charge, although it is distributed, have sometimes put that money into the payroll pot to be distributed out. So whether that's, I mean, it's in the legislation, so I'm quite sure that won't change. It will be service charge, tips, gratuities, and however that additional money comes in. But discretionary service charge, how discretionary is it? That was one of the questions we asked. People do dispute it. I know just from my own personal experience, when my son goes out for a meal, he's not that old, he's not really earning a good salary, he goes out and he budgets how much they look at the menu, and then if there's a service charge on top, it's like, maybe they literally haven't got enough money to cover it. So I know he has disputed it. But I'm sure that can't be comfortable for a late teen to have to dispute a service charge. It's a very awkward thing. And perhaps the more traditional way of giving a tip was easier for those people to deal with. Shall we move on to agency staff? Do you want to comment a little bit on? Oh, go on.
I thought I'd pick up on a point, going back to the discretionary, which is picking up on you mentioned about holiday pay and pensions, and I think sort of just looking outside the box a little bit, I suppose, in terms of the consequences potentially of this legislation, but from an employment law perspective, I think it's an interesting point, because I specialise in pay compliance and NMW and holiday pay being two of those aspects. And I think the holiday pay point is actually quite an interesting one, because I've had this question before, whether tips and gratuity service charge should be included, and it's that debate around, well, the employer has no control at the moment. Certainly, obviously, it is a discretion, but I appreciate a degree of discretion, let's say, as we heard on the video, and so therefore there might be that debate about whether that actually should be included in the holiday pay calculation. I don't know how many might be doing that right now. And a consequence, I think, potentially of this legislation is I think that might turn the dial more towards potentially holiday pay having to include these payments as well. and that obviously will have an impact on the labour costs of these businesses.
Can I ask you then, how do you distinguish between whose money this is? Is it the customer paying the employee these discretionary amounts, or is it the employer? Because the customer's not going to pay the holiday pay of the employee.
I mean, I'd be looking at it purely from the perspective of what the legislation will state around how you calculate holiday pay. So where I'm sort of focusing from is the calculation of holiday pay is based upon the definition of a week's pay in the Employment Rights Act. And that definition changes depending upon the way in which the person works. I don't want to get sort of drawn into that. It's quite a complicated area, but ultimately I'd be looking then at sort of those distinct definitions, and holiday pay has been debated massively in the courts over the last, since I've been practicing as a lawyer. And we've kind of like got to a point where we're still a little bit uncertain, and we've got some consultations out at the moment from the government. So I agree, and I think it's an interesting debate, and I just thought I wanted to pick up on that point because I do think it's a relevant factor just in relation to the decision making that you might take in relation to what you do. And again, the same with pensions, because obviously it depends upon what the definition of pensionable earnings is in relation to the scheme that you've adopted. So if you're following pension auto-enrolment and you're simply applying the basic minimums, it depends upon whether you're just using qualifying earnings under the legislation or you've adopted an alternative requirement for that definition. But I just thought it's interesting to pick up on that point because I think it's going to be a debate we will see playing out.
I do feel that it won't be too much of a debate because Katie will be very happy. A lot of companies will go through trunk, and the moment that it's trunk, it will definitely not be part of the employment package. So my view, this whole process of fairness, okay, I understand. We do have some difference of opinions on the fairness of it. And it's not the first time that we've had, Howard and I have had these conversations, but for having been working in the five-star luxury business, I agree that it's necessary to have fairness, and fairness is not fairness towards the customer, allow my frankness, it's fairness towards our employees. Because literally I've worked in companies 20 years ago where 5% were going to the employees and 95% were going to as a credit somewhere. So that I think that the majority of hoteliers in London who are of a certain size, again, I'm not speaking about family-run businesses who might have another approach, we are all into fairness. We know that anyway, we can't go away from it. So the 100%, it's not even a matter of discussion in my view. We will all go for trunk. I think that there was one five-star luxury hotel who last year was still doing service charges rather than trunk, perhaps two. One of them is in here, I think. And I know for a fact that they are all trying to move out of it because they understand the legal impact that such a law would have if that continues to be an obligation towards the employee. So I don't think that that would be the biggest problem. I don't think neither that it would be a problem of fairness because employees are much more, they are smarter. And to be honest, at the moment, it's an employee market rather than an employer market. So literally, if you know that one company is paying you in a more fair way than another, you will leave. So we have no other choice. My concern really, on the legal side, is much more the relationship that we are having with third parties. Because obviously you have employees, workers, and agencies. Mm-hmm. And here, as far as I know, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a finance person, the whole relationship, legal relationship that we have with third parties, and most of us are using them, maybe agencies or casuals. Mm-hmm. This whole relationship is to protect us, not to have them as employees. Mm-hmm. So therefore, we've all based that on the supervision aspect of it, making sure that we're not supervising them directly, or if not, if I'm not wrong, we end up having a liability to treat them with exactly the same level of salary, same level of benefit than our own employees.
After 12 weeks qualifying service.
Which is generally the case, because to be honest, we need people to stay. We don't want to train them again and again and again. Now, if that is happening, and we have to include them in our trunk system, are we not creating an additional burden that would prove that actually they are direct employees, to be honest? And that's where, on the legal side, I'm really, really concerned about it. I'm not even speaking about the VAT and NI side that you and I had a chat about 2 weeks ago, but truly, this is my concern, is on the legal side, what will be the approach that we will have through our agencies? Because if suddenly I'm becoming the employer of all my third parties, I'm really in trouble.
Mm.
Of course, sorry.
Yeah, go.
Of course, at the moment, the social security legislation is set so that troncs only apply to employees. So there isn't any facility currently for any third-party individuals to be part of a tronc arrangement. So
we do have a lot of we have a lot of employers that are using agencies, as well as they're maybe having casual staff and their permanent staff. A couple, obviously at the moment, there is nothing that prevents them from potentially paying agency workers as well. A couple of them do already do that. They do pay amounts to the agency workers because otherwise it would artificially inflate the amount that their staff are generally receiving. So they would price themselves way above the market and end up with a situation there, and they backfill those positions that are being used by filled by agency staff.
I'm surprised because I thought that the tronc system should not be, normally it shouldn't be distributed to agencies because they're not part of the system.
Yeah, there's nothing that prevents that at this point, yeah.
So I think that the companies that are doing that are going to wake up with
And
starts.
there's been a lot of talk about employers having no control over a tronc system. That doesn't mean they can't be involved in an advisory capacity, because the tronc master needs to know how the service operates, and in order to make a fair allocation, you need to know what's happening within the business. So the employer can give some advice to the tronc master in terms of, this is how the service operates, this is how this level is within that team, that kind of thing. It's very clear in the national insurance manuals that the tronc master cannot be coerced by the employer. So the employer cannot say to them, you must pay this person this much, but they can give information to the tronc master to make the right decisions.
Because companies are coming up with the tronc system. They are actually putting each companies, whether they are doing the targeted earnings or a point system. It's not the tronc master who comes up with all these ins and outs.
Yeah.
So, and we know national insurance contribution should only be paid if it's not a guaranteed earnings, it's only targeted earnings, but essentially it means the same. And it's the company who comes up with these rules.
Yeah,
and then the tronc master is only following these rules with the new employee. When they are enrolling, they are saying, this is what we can give you per hour, or this is our point system.
Yeah.
The tronc master is only following these, but they are not actually have much freedom to give more or less. And they are going to be, eventually they are going to be just an administrator to say, yes, these rules are followed.
I think it depends on the tronc master. There are a lot of certainly internal tronc masters where that's the case. I mean, I can't comment on what other external tronc masters are doing, but I wouldn't say that's the case most of the time with externals. I think that there's been a lot of quite innocently incorrect practice within tronc systems. We often come across, speaking to clients or prospectives where they didn't know that, perhaps an HR manager shouldn't be a tronc master because they're actually hiring and firing. They're the extension of the employer. We've seen lots of different kind of practices that people are very innocently doing wrong, or in the more cynical sense, there are some, very obvious puppet sort of situations happening with tronc masters. But I think that's where there will be some more clear legislation on it, and businesses will have to become a bit more transparent and careful in who they choose as their tronc master.
Well, because the main aim is to be more transparent and more fair, we will need proper systems. Yeah. And I think most of the companies are running their tronc system on a spreadsheet. And if these are needs to be looked into and investigated, it's going to take a long time.
Yeah.
And if we need to be ready for April 2024 to implement a new system, it would take not just a long time, but also a lot of money.
I mean, it depends. I mean, I think if, you know, if you're using technology most of the time, it can be a cost saver. It will, you know, work with you. I do take your point about big spreadsheets and lots of data going into those. There are definitely trunk systems working like that. I mean, from our perspective, because we are part of a software group as well, we've always used our developers to write code to do the heavy lifting there. So I think more trunk systems will have to look at how they become more integrated with the rest of the, I mean, hotels, restaurants, all sorts of hospitality businesses have really moved forward in integrating all their different types of software together so that it works as a kind of holistic, you know, mechanism. And I think that trunks will have to become part of that as well.
Sorry, going to a simple question. So service charge really just started when minimum wage started to apply to people working in restaurants. So that's after what you start, so it's in restaurants and so on, starting to charge service charge. Would it be considered as a legal advice to go back to you getting paid your salary, so you get your own tips, you deal with them, and the company just move away from it, don't add any service charge into the bills, and let their own waiter, receptionist, chambermaid, whoever it is, to get their own tip and do with it?
I mean, obviously that will potentially be an option for consideration. And yeah, from what you're saying, you can see the upside being the removal of the risk under this legislation. It won't have an impact if you're simply allowing the worker to collect the tips from whatever it is they're doing, and you have no involvement in then how that tip is then allocated. Obviously, from the national minimum wage perspective, again, you need to make sure that whatever you are paying them, the national minimum wage calculation that you're doing, again, to be very clear on that, national minimum wage is not simply about paying that hourly rate. It's a calculation. You need to make sure you're complying with that whole process. And whatever the tip that might be left by someone or service charge has absolutely no inclusion within that calculation because it cannot be counted towards national minimum wage. Certainly not going to give advice, but it's an option for consideration.
I think from an operator perspective, how do you think your team would feel if they knew that individuals were able to earn tips and the rest of them that had been part of the customer experience didn't?
No, we've been no fair. But I agree with the gentleman. I think it should be a contract, so you get your wages and service charge. I think should be split equally between the team. I think the people in hospitality should be paid for what they do. So you have a contract, that's it, this is your contract. So service charge sometimes is used to build the contract for the hospitality people. I think this is wrong. You should have your specific contract plus the service charge is distributed equally between the team.
Okay, for us, it's very important to pay living wage to start with, and anybody that works in F&B will get service charge on top of the contract. And I think sometimes the service charge masks the idea that you pay somebody a bit less because they get service charge.
Exactly.
And it's easier to pay somebody more, and says, then you know the chefs are not going to get tips because they're in the kitchen, so the guy on the floor is going to get the tips, then you balance by paying them properly, instead of trying to make it up by having whatever, £4,000, £5,000 of service charge every year. So it's not about not paying people, it's about, making people a fair option.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean about not paying people equally. I just meant more that if you want people to work as a team and to overperform to create better customer experiences, then that everyone being involved in in receiving those monies encourages that behaviour.
I've got a question there at the back.
Hi. Good morning. It's Lloyd from the Shangri-La at the Shard. So I have, first off, of course, a question around the legal term or definition of what is classed as tips, service charge, and gratuities. Because, of course, we run two models within the business. One's a trunk model and one's, of course, a service charge model. Because we charge our rooms guests a service charge and F&B also gets charged service charge. But F&B people, of course, gets paid on a trunk model. Rooms department gets paid on a service charge model along with some of the back of house stuff. So my question is, if you're calling it service charge within the legislation, what if the businesses call it something else, like, facilities fees or, resort fees, hotel fees? I mean, you could get into the legal terms, right? Saying that, okay, we're going to class it something else and treat it totally something different. I mean, is that provision being looked at, or?
Shall I?
You go ahead.
Yeah. I'll have a go. Yeah, and look, I think that it's about, my view would be to approach it in the spirit in which the legislation is being introduced. And I think any attempt to try to get around it would be seen through by an employment tribunal. They would look at the reality of the situation, because I think effectively what this will do is it will create now a legal framework by which a worker or an employee or an agency worker, and I do want to pick up on that point just on the agency workers as well, can pursue a claim where they don't feel that they've had their fair allocation of tips. And so in that instance, an employment tribunal will be there to judge whether that has happened. And they will, I think, take their interpretation will be, well, let's look at the context in which this legislation was introduced. Some of the debates in Parliament will be considered as part of that sort of interpretation. But I would say, I think if you are collecting any form of payment from a customer or client, and it's being paid to you, or it's being paid to the worker, and you're then taking it from them, and it is in some way connected to it being a gratuity or a tip, or in some way discretionary on behalf of that client or customer to say a thank you and well done for the work that was done, then I think you're very much at risk of that being deemed to be caught by this legislation. So all I would say is that where you're trying to give something the appearance, in any occasion, in any law tax, where you're giving something the appearance that it genuinely isn't, you will normally get caught on that basis. But that's my view. Yeah.
Even more than that is an inspector of taxes will see that this is a disingenuous hidden service charge and could penalise you as far back as 4 years worth of national insurance, both the employees and the employers.
What my question was, right? What if you define it as something else? What if you just call it its?
I think that's
I think if you swallow it into one fee, that's fine. That's
yeah.
That's that.
And these will be things that will be, as I said, these things might play out as a consequence, and
The code of practice.
Yeah, exactly, and what we've already potentially seen from HMRC, but we'll now have another sort of interpretation that will come from the employment tribunals, which will look at what's actually happening in practice. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just one of those where it would be the cautious approach is the best approach. But
I think the legislation as it's written is very wide, isn't it? It basically says service charge however it's described. I mean, we don't see those sort of words defined in legislation very often to essentially capture everything. So it is a very important point as to what is going to be caught. And I don't think it's just going to be called what is known as service charge or labelled service charge that's going to be involved.
Stephanie.
If it was to be called something else, should it not fall under VAT as a valuable supplier 20% or whatever the rate is?
Martin, do you want to comment on that? You've got a VAT expert here.
We've been talking about it because, like Jackie says, the guidance, the legislation at the moment is quite wide. So for that purposes, we've got a difference between mandatory service charge and discretionary service charge. So if it's a mandatory service charge, we'd expect VAT on it. Discretionary service charge, we wouldn't. And the interesting thing about the legislation so far, it does have one very small reference to VAT. It says amounts excluding VAT. So my question really is, it's interesting. Do they expect mandatory service charges to be brought in also? I also like the comment about, can you call it something else? And my question there is, you can call it whatever you like, but it's a question of what you're going to do with that money. So are you going to pass that, you can call it a fee for anything, but are you still going to pass that money down to the employee? Or are you just trying to collect additional revenue for the business that should probably be subject to VAT, depending upon the underlying VAT liability of the supply. So, yeah, it's interesting. But I don't think at the moment the two departments within HMRC or Treasury talk to each other very well. So it's an interesting point that I don't think they would have considered.
I'm just picking this up because of the mention of VAT, and I just wonder how many people around here are working in organisations where the system, and this is, I haven't experienced anything other than this, is that you get a bill and the service charge or gratuity is added to the total of the bill that already includes VAT. So when we're talking about 5%, 10%, whatever it is, actually it's not. It's much more than that, because we are paying that service charge or tip on the amount of the bill, including VAT.
It's not mandatory, Howard. I've checked. It's not mandatory.
It may not be mandatory, but that's what happens. That's what systems do. So I think, you know, we're kidding ourselves in terms of that part, because we're actually paying more out as service charge and tips than we're saying we are, because it's not VAT free to the customer. And my other point is, there are a lot of accountants here, or at least I hope there are, because that's what I'm here for. And when you do your P&Ls, I think the idea that we should be moving towards including all these items in the revenue and all the amounts that we pay out in the costs. And whether they're obligatory or discretionary or whatever, it really doesn't matter, because in the end, if you take in 100% and pay out 100%, you still can see it. It should be transparent. How on earth can you rate or can you assess your own business leaving out anything between 5 and 25% of your revenue? And how can you compare one business to another if you put all these things through a balance sheet account and they never appear anywhere? So that's my two.
Stephanie, did you have something else to add?
Yeah, it's totally separate because we can continue. I think that we will have a coffee, Howard and I. Okay. No, actually, I wanted to speak about operation. I have a very strong idea on everything anyway, but on the service charge specifically. My question is really, what is your feedback that you got from operations after COVID? Because I was not in London during COVID, and as far as I know, suddenly a lot of people in operations who are traditionally the ones who are receiving most of the service charges, ended up from having a salary of 40k per year to 20k per year, or 60k per year to 20k per year, as bad as some service charges systems are made. What do you see that your colleagues want? Because as much as you said about fairness, I know a lot of people in service who don't want to give it to the loading bay, for example. So what do you consider as fair after COVID? Because literally all of you have suffered about it during COVID.
As I said before, I think what is fair is to have a proper job offer based on salary. Then what is a plus, like service charge, is something that will come up later. So even during COVID, you know, the furlough was covered our salary, but basically our salary is based even with service charge. So probably the 35-40% is service charge in hospitality industry. So the furlough covered just our wages. So what I think in terms of feedback, what I really think is like different job. Like if you're an architect or lawyer or wherever you go, people hiring you, they offer you a proper contract for what you do. That's all. Then it should be the same for hospitality. If you are a general manager, if you are a restaurant manager, if you are a waiter, you go there and people hire you, and then the service charge should be something like a bonus on top of it. So this is what I really think.
And when you go for an interview, when your colleagues are going for an interview, are you not asking, but what is the average service charge?
Yeah, no, this is unclear. Now it's getting better. But I remember when I started 5-6 years ago, it was a mess. You were going there, you sit down, there was this minimum wage, as the gentleman was saying, and then there was a plus service charge, question mark. Okay, people don't know what to answer. Don't take me wrong, sometimes it was even good. But you know, sometimes it was even good, you know, like 5-6 years ago, it was even good money. But it was not controlled. So like you came up in January with half of the salary that you get in December. Okay, So it was not stable for us, you know, to build, to pay the rent, you know, to go out, because the salary exactly was not stable during the month. It was up and down. In December, you were, my God, it was like very rich, and then in January, it was, again, you drop the 50% of your salary. I think it must be controlled, this, yeah.
So the new law makes it impossible to do what we used to do in the old times.
Yeah, that's good.
Which is, no, yes, but listen, because in the old times,
Well.
the hotels were able to say, okay, on average, let's say that it's 12,000 pounds per year that you will get. We will give you automatically £1,000 per month, whatever the month, because we are able to move that across, and we'll do a special bonus just before the summer for your holidays, or just after Christmas for you to be able to get back into the fund. All that will disappear. You do realize that.
Not really.
Fairer.
Yeah, but from the other side, now you have a control. So basically, many companies in the past, they get extra revenue from service charge. So there were money coming in, and not the 100% of the money they were giving to the staff. Okay, now it's different. Now 95% or 100% of this money goes to the staff. Now it's up to us how to share it and control it. You know, because in the past, the big company, what they did is making extra revenue, like taking 70, 80% of those money, it's a lot of money, as extra revenue. Now it's different, because now we control those money, we have the 100% control of those money. This is why, back on your question, I think it's good to have an external trunk master with a trunk committee meeting. So we do meeting on weekly basis or monthly basis with Katie. So we have 4 or 5 people representing the different departments of the hotel. And we still go through a spreadsheet. Point system can be fair or not, but still, I think is a good improvement compared in the past.
Currently, the trunk master, the external trunk master's cost is coming out of your trunk.
Yes.
So you are foregoing 2.5%, 3%, whatever they're charging. So you are getting less. Going forward, it's going to be paid, or has to be paid by the company, which is just going to cripple the company, because there are so many paying the national insurance. They pay. So I think it's, so currently you are foregoing some of the money.
Yeah, the thing is, internal can be very dangerous, because in some operation, the service charge the amount is crazy high. Okay, and even in the past, I saw people controlling all those money, splitting and sharing those money in no fair way. You know, I think with an external person is good, because they don't know, in this case, the external person doesn't know the people directly, so we can create a point system and then share fairly all the monies.
External company, if you come up with a point system, and you are getting an additional point if you are picking up an additional shift, or you are losing a point if you are constantly late, it is the rules are made by the company. The trunk master, external or internal, they are just following that. And yes, in some cases there can be that some companies are rogue and they are giving certain people more money. I think it's, hopefully it's fine.
I get the point. I think the company still has a percentage in terms of decision, but we decide, for example, the minimum guaranteed for specific.
You can't say minimum guarantee. As soon as you say minimum guarantee, it's NIable. So I think this is where the issue comes, that somebody comes to you for a job offer, and you are saying, we are going to employ you on minimum wage, but we are guaranteeing you £15. Or your targeted earnings is £15, because this is the word you can use.
So the employer cannot say that.
Sorry?
The employer cannot say that. But a trunk master can have levels for different job roles and can have amounts.
Having an interview with a potential employee. It's an HR person or a
No.
Yes,
yeah.
And they would like to know approximately how much am I going to earn, because they will make a decision whether they're going to take their job or not. And if you would say in January, would you be able to work for minimum wage, because there's not going to be enough trunk, because the trunk master or they won't be able to flat that.
I think it depends on the trunk system. So I think the trunk master's role is to make sure that those situations don't happen. So, for example, if there are amounts that are going out to staff that they're relying on, then they should never be more than your lowest month, so that you know that those amounts are still going to the staff. So if January is your quietest month, then the amounts that are going out to staff that they are used to shouldn't really be more than that, so that then anything else throughout the year is, on top of that, is a variable bonus to them. You know, trunk masters shouldn't be able to allocate anything based on punishment for lateness or performance. Those are all things that are controlled by the employer. So if trunk masters are doing that, then they aren't doing things properly. They shouldn't be allocating anything that the employer is making the decision on in terms of the employee's performance. The only things they should be able to make decisions on are the structure of the business in terms of the service operation. And those should be non-biased decisions.
Interesting. Charlie, I know you said you wanted to pick up on something about the agency stuff. My feeling on agency is that they were always paid a little bit more because they were rewarded for their flexibility and therefore didn't really expect service charge, but that's all changing now as well. But I know you said you wanted to pick up on something about agency
Yeah, thank
stuff.
you. It was just because I think that there was a bit of a concern here, I wasn't there around, okay, well, if this legislation is going to mean that we're going to have to include agency workers within the tronc or somehow make sure that tips are allocated to them, does that mean that I'm now going to be their employer? And I don't think it will do that, because agency worker regulations are very clear about what the definition of an agency worker is and who the employer is in that situation. So I don't think it would mean that you would be deemed to be the employer. But yeah, it now creates, obviously, an additional obligation that's placed upon you. Ultimately, as far as I can read from the legislation, it's the agent that would be liable if there was any concern from the agency worker that they weren't be fairly allocating tips. But obviously what that will mean, that will play through in relation to your negotiations with your labour supply chain as to, well, okay, how then, obviously that will play through into the costs potentially, but in terms of what those contracts will say about what information sharing needs to go on about how then we deal with any complaints concerning agency workers and what they should have received as a consequence of this piece of legislation. So yeah, that is an added level of, there's obviously complexity from how the tronc will operate, but then will be complexity around your negotiations with your labour supply chain and obviously the pricing models of how that will operate. But I don't see it creating then that employment relationship in my view. No.
We are coming into the final few minutes. Checking my notes. The one thing we didn't really cover that I think probably we should make everyone aware of is where you've got multiple sites and employees. I don't know which one of you wants to pick up on the complexity of that. Katie, you're nodding away.
Yeah, so if you have multiple sites, the trunk or the service charge within each site should be distributed to the people working in that site. If people work across multiple sites, then their shifts within their site should be paid from that site. But if you have something like a prep kitchen or a head office or customer services, that's a central unit that services all the sites, they can benefit from the trunk within each site. What hasn't been made clear yet is, if there's any restriction on that. Practically, I think it doesn't make sense not to be able to share that with a prep kitchen or, customer relations, reservation staff, that might service all sites. But yeah, we're just waiting for the code of practice really to see what that means in terms of the new legislation. Currently, when our clients have that situation, usually what we do is check the kind of hours worked within, for example, a prep kitchen, and then share that equally amongst all the sites that they're servicing in terms of applying some of that trunk. But we just don't know if there's going to be something more specific, because that's just a logical, fair option that we've decided applies, but there is no rule currently about that.
I think also if you've got staff that you've got multiple sites and you're saying, can you go and work in Whitechapel today as opposed to Knightsbridge, and the tips are better in Knightsbridge, then they're going to have a battle with their staff. So I think there's possible problems there as well. Yes, please, over there, sir.
Question with regards to having a central team dipping into the deal with various sites. Would that mean then that each site would have their own agreement with what that central share would be, or would that be across a group-wide decision?
So So usually, I mean, from my perspective, we would describe how a central site might be included within a system in the employees' agreements anyway. If you have separate sites, if they're separate PAYE schemes, then each one should have their own employee agreement. If it's one PAYE scheme but with multiple sites, one agreement should be able to cover it. But yes, you should explain how a central site might be included within the scheme.
Last question, I think, Jan.
Yeah, when it comes to employees and the fair distribution, is there any definition in the law then who can be excluded, or is it actually anybody in the business? Because at the minute, if we're very used to splitting it, for example, in F&B, just amongst the waiters and the kitchen and maybe a bit of stewarding, and that's sort of it. But after this, is there then an opportunity for everyone to say, but wait a minute, there's so much money going on in service charge, I would like to have a share of that. I think I should be awarded a slice of that as well.
I mean, at the moment, legislation doesn't have anything on that. It's just employees and workers. So I think that is one of those issues that we would hope to see dealt with in the guidance.
Yeah. Because I can imagine that there will be a lot of people queuing at the HR door asking, where's my share now, given that I've heard about the change in the law.
Yeah.
And for me, yeah, from my perspective, and thinking sort of, again, I'm thinking about sort of like that mitigation of risk and also what could happen. And that's one of the biggest concerns I have, is then addressing this obviously new obligation and then what complaints could follow as a consequence, and this record information request as well causes me a bit of concern.
And I guess that would make no difference whether or not you have an actual trunk in place, because I think the question would still remain the same. Given that with a trunk you probably outsourced your, let's say, your responsibility somewhat, but again, if half the staff in your hotel is not included in that trunk, because traditionally we never paid them such, how would you sort of go about that?
Howard's very keen to add something, but we are almost out of time, so you've got 30 seconds, Howard.
Okay, try and keep it quick. This has all been very serious. I just wanted to tell you a little anecdote, which I don't know how true it is, but Bill Gates was having a meal in a restaurant, and at the end of the meal, he gave the waiter a $5 note. And the waiter really looked at him and he said, $5? He said, is that all you're going to give me? And Bill Gates, he said to Bill Gates, well, your son was here last week and he gave me $500. So Bill Gates said, he's the son of the wealthiest man in the world. My father was a woodcutter.
Brilliant. So there will be, I think all of our panellists are joining us upstairs for lunch, so I'm sure they'll be happy to answer any questions. We will be preparing, outside where we were having coffee, we had the guide that, as I said, Howard and some of Jackie's old colleagues helped us put together a few years ago. We will be doing a new one, but it's too early for us to start doing that because we haven't got the code of practice guidance and whatever. But so the guide that you've seen today, and there probably are still some left, are valid now, but they're not probably going to be valid so much in the future. I think so we will have a new guide. This has been recorded today, so please feel free once we've got that all edited to share with colleagues, because I think the debate is an interesting and definitely an ongoing one. And we are welcoming any thoughts, feedback throughout as well, because the more information we have, the better our lobbying with UK Hospitality will be. I think the conclusion is that we've still got a lot more to talk about. Transparency and fairness seem to be the key words of the day, and whether we call it a service charge or a resort fee, well, I think we've just got to agree that it's going to the workers, and we're going to have to work with that as best we can. But a big round of applause for my experts too, because they have been fabulous.